Okay, in this video I wanted to go over the quiz number 3, both because a student asked me to and because I hope that this will help you with your strategies for taking quizzes. As I've said before, quizzes are a tool in this class as much for learning as they are for testing. So you want to be able to go through the quizzes and in your 2 attempts, go back to the slides, go back to the book, maybe use a dictionary, whatever things you need in order to be able to get the correct answers, because that's how one of the main tools for how you'll learn the main points in this class. So again, there are always a lot of different ways to get to a correct answer, and I'm just going to try to mix things up and go through different ones on different questions in thinking about this quiz number 3 in particular. So question 1 says, stress researchers are more likely to discuss mental health problems rather than emotional wellness. This is something that comes up right in the beginning of the chapter. It comes up on that first slide after the title slide. And it's also just word for word taken from your book. So in the right around the middle of page 21, it's very clearly stated. Researchers also tend to focus on mental health oops, wrong sentence. Stress researchers are more likely to discuss mental health problems rather than emotional wellness. And these mental health problems are distinguished further down the page from major mental illnesses. And this is an important point that'll come up in some of the other quiz questions here. The second question about anger. Anger is the most studied mental health issue in stress research. Well, here I've underlined anger and I've italicized the word most. Not trying to trick you there. I'm trying to draw your attention to those two words so that you can focus on them. So this is discussed in your book in great detail. You'll notice that the slide number 3 right here says depression, the most commonly studied mental health consequence of stress. And then once you get over to slide 5, it says anger is not a big focus of stress research. So when the question says anger is the most studied mental health issue, the answer is then pretty clearly false. Question number 3 says, unlike psychosocial linkages, biological pathways linking stress and mental health affect all humans equally. This is discussed in your book. Again, I also have a slide on biological pathways, and we're looking here for whether people are affected equally, and this bottom bullet point says not everyone is equally affected by biological factors that relate stress and mental health. And this is a question that I ask because I think sometimes people think that, well, it's biology, it has to do with our bodies, and bodies are usually pretty much the same, unlike social conditions. But certainly there's no evidence at this point, and that's what Carr discusses with us. Now, for the multiple answer questions, you do have to go through and see which ones you can confirm, as correct and which ones is incorrect. So these questions should be taking you longer as you're going through the quiz than some of the other questions. This one says, which of the following mental health outcomes are commonly examined in stress research because they could afflict almost any person at a particularly difficult time in their lives? Now, this question is written about on slide 2. It is on page 21, word for word. That's the sentence that I was accidentally starting to read earlier. Stress researchers also tend to focus on mental health symptoms that could afflict almost any person at a particularly difficult time in their lives. These symptoms generally include depression, anxiety, anger, and grief. I'd also like to point out that as you go through pages 24 to 30 in your book, you have you're reading a section that's called general symptoms, and there are subsections that are labeled for each of these: depression, anxiety, anger, and grief. And those section headings are there again to draw your attention to what you'll be reading in there, to have you realize that under the general category of general symptoms, you have these four subheadings that are important. And when, again, in the process of trying to verify that some of these answers are incorrect, you can read about schizophrenia, suicide, and bipolar. These are things that are talked about as very uncommon. So when the question says almost any person at a difficult time in their lives, suicide, schizophrenia, and bipolar are not likely to happen to almost any person. On this last one, post-traumatic growth, there are a couple of clues that this one may not be a correct answer for this question. One is that post-traumatic growth is talked about in a completely different section of the chapter from these other four, right? So the structure of the writing matters. It's done like that on purpose, right? Because it wants you to follow through with ideas in a certain progression. Another thing is that the question says it could afflict, right? If this is a word that you're not really familiar with, by all means, look it up in the dictionary, right? If you Google, the first thing that comes up is probably a definition for afflict. And this word means something causing pain or suffering, right? So post-traumatic growth is not something negative as in depression, anger, anxiety, and grief. It's just a different, it's a separate issue, and that's why it's discussed separately. It's not something that we would talk about as afflicting people. The next question here, it asks about chapter 2 in general. In chapter 2, Carr discusses what? Right? So when you're asked really broadly about the whole chapter, you definitely have to go through and try to do the process of elimination on these answer choices. This first one says a variety of mental health outcomes and pathways linking stress and mental health. Okay, well, we read in this chapter about depression, anxiety, PTSD, different mental health outcomes, and then pathways linking stress and mental health. We read about biological pathways. We read about cumulative disadvantage and other psychosocial pathways in this chapter. So that seems like probably a good answer, but I'm not going to stop there. You should always go through all of them. Right? This one says only negative reactions to stress where people have no ability to bounce back. Well, you remember reading about post-traumatic growth, right? You remember reading that some anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing for some people. So when it says only negative reactions, that leads me to cross that one out. I can say that's not the correct answer here, but I'm going to keep going, right? The next one says examples of stressors that never lead to mental health problems. I don't know why the chapter would discuss examples of stressors that never lead to mental health problems, since the chapter is called How and Why Stress Affects Our Mental Health, right? That one just doesn't really make much sense, so I would scratch it out just using logic. But if you're not using that kind of logic, you could just think of one of the stressors talked about, like roles, social roles, and then think about whether she talked about them leading to mental health problems, and indeed Carr did discuss that. This last answer choice says research evidence that shows overwhelming dominance of biological linkages rather than evidence for social and psychological pathways. Now, this is one that, as with many of these, you could go about answering it in different ways. You could notice that biological pathways was a pretty small section of the chapter compared to the other sections that talked about social and psychological pathways. You could also realize that this is a sociology class and a sociology quiz, so I'm not probably very likely to assign you to read something that's talking about biology being overwhelmingly dominant in this. So I would scratch out that answer. And again, the first answer is the only one that really seems to fit. In this next question, it says Carr describes which of the following as a component or components of depression. And again, that's something that is covered in your chapter in a section very clearly labeled for depression, but it's also its own slide where right here it says depression, 4 components: emotional, cognitive, motivational, and somatic. So I would go over here and say, oh, emotional, cognitive, motivational, somatic, I better choose all of these. Right, and you'll notice that each time you take the quiz, the questions and the answer choices probably come up in different order, and that's just to make sure people are, it's really to kind of further encourage you to really be writing down or printing out or doing something that allows you to go back and look up the questions and answers before your second attempt. That's what I want you to do, again, because the point of the quiz is as much about learning as it is about testing what you've learned. Now, question 7 here is one of the harder questions included in this quiz, and the reason that it's harder is because the answers are not clearly laid out in the slides, right? And you'll run into questions like this on the quizzes because the quizzes your quiz grades should distinguish between students who are just going through the slides and taking quizzes and those students who are really digging into the chapters and reading carefully. So not only are the slides brief, I can't and don't pull out all of the important points, but in some examples like this question, there are things that are important, but they're kind of secondarily important. They're important for understanding some broader issues that come up in other questions and that will come up, and how you're able to understand and use the research evidence that gets presented throughout the semester. So in this question, it says, which of the following is true of the common approaches to research on the relationship between stress and mental health? Well, I can see that I have 2 answers, and I need to know if I can rule out one or both, or if I can confirm one or both of these answers. And this last one here, many stress researchers base their studies on large surveys of the U.S. population. Well, that one's talked about pretty early on in the chapter. Again, that first big section is called What is Mental Health and How Do We Study It? So when we're thinking about approaches to research, that's how we study something. And so near the top of page 22, it says, Additionally, many stress researchers conduct their studies by using large surveys of the U.S. population, right? And this is one of the points that helps you understand how and why we don't focus on those less common experiences like serious mental illnesses, but also helps you to understand how and why stress research is done like this, why the approaches that are taken are really useful for helping us understand and make changes, that those changes might affect the most people as possible. This next answer choice says the mental health effects of stress may be overstated when studies are based on clinical or psychiatric populations, right? So large surveys of the U.S. population, that's trying to capture people in the United States as a whole, whereas this is talking about clinical or psychiatric populations. These are people who have already sought medical attention for the mental health effects of their stress. And this is talked about beginning right at the bottom of page 26. Research approaches that examine stress and mental health in clinical populations, or in those populations already seeking psychiatric care, may overstate the harmful emotional effects of stress precisely because their studies are focused on those who by definition are suffering from a mental health problem, right? They've already recognized their health, their mental health as being bad enough to seek medical attention. So if we had based most of our evidence just on that, we would be thinking, we might be thinking that the connection between stress and mental health is much more serious or overstated. All right, the last 2 questions. This one says, according to Chapter 2, stress-induced anxiety can have both positive and negative consequences, right? This is, again, anxiety is on its own slide, and here it says it may be helpful, but it may be debilitating. So we're thinking positive and negative health consequences there. Question number 9 about role accumulation. You may notice that role accumulation doesn't show up on your